some senses, happily, is fairly small. And so there are other scholars out there who specialize in Ruskin letters and Ruskin diaries. There's still Ruskin, probably some thousands of Ruskin's letters I've never read, and certainly I've not read all the diaries, but I've read almost all the diaries in their original manuscripts. So I contacted the scholars who have knowledge, much more knowledge of the letters than I do and the diaries than I do, and I said, is there anything in them that would suggest that Ruskin was a pedophile? And having full knowledge of these things, they all assured me that there was nothing. There are a few letters that suggest some kind of erotic interest in the Ruskin canon if you go through them. Whenever Ruskin writes anything that has even, I'm trying not to suggest that Ruskin was, you'll see this in a moment, that Ruskin was not an asexual person. But he was a person who was very deeply concerned about the role of sexuality in life, and he was not going to misuse it. So occasionally he might say something in a letter to Joan or to another of his more intimate recipients of letters, and he says that he's got this impulse, and he says, he will often say he's been terribly naughty and he shouldn't have said those kinds of things. So we do find a little bit of this, but never in these same letters do we find any desire for following them up. We find no desire to seek out the girls. He never did. We find no desire for, nothing that indicates that he is interested in having actual sexual relations with them. He's sort of playing around with the idea, sort of like a naughty teenager of the time. And it's always important to keep in mind as we talk about this, that a pedophile is, remember the definition, someone who has recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasy, sexual urges or behaviors involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children. Ruskin never does. A couple of other things to say about this, and then I'm about done with this first part of the talk here. To have the naughty thoughts, which he only has in a very, if I was to give a percentage, what would it be? It would be something like maybe 2% of the 1,000% of the thousands of letters that I've read have anything that even vaguely hint at something of this nature. There is never any suggestion that he wants to consummate the thoughts. There is never any suggestion that he wants to go and see these young women or that he's talking about and so on. There's a letter from August of '88 when Ruskin is in Sandgate where he writes to Joan, and she's going to a town in England called Sedgwick, and he writes this: "Please give my love to all my old flames at Sedgwick." But we can be pretty sure, knowing what we do, that those flames were at the very best embers. Ruskin never went after finding any of these girls. So there's another set of letters which are really quite fun in their way to read. He's in Europe on this last, no, it's on the continental tour before it, so it's probably '82. He's in Europe in '82. He's in Rome, and he's in the Sistine Chapel. And if you've been there, perhaps you've seen this wonderful drawing of Botticelli's of this beautiful young woman by the name of Zippora. And Ruskin talks in his letters about how beautiful she is and how he adores her and how he would love to sort of see her. But of course, she's only a painting. He never did see her. And so but if you have a good look at her, there's nothing of the little girl about her. She is a sexually mature young woman that he's attracted to. So in almost all of these cases, these are at the most fantasies on Ruskin's part. So in essence, taking this first argument that Ruskin was a pedophile and a predator and a sexually reprehensible person, in my research, there is absolutely no evidence whatever which would lead us to entertain this thought seriously that Ruskin ever met any of the criteria that are set out in DSM-5 about what constitutes someone who could be called pedophile. In short, Hilton. In short, Robeson. In short, everybody who went after the whole characterization of Ruskin as a pedophile afterwards have no idea what they're talking about, and they're completely wrong in the characterization. It is a misdiagnosis, if diagnosis it ever was, of severe consequence, because it has been used against Ruskin in so many ways negatively. To complete the picture, there are only three. There are three other paraphilias where men, it's always men, remember, who are sexually attracted to young women. One group, men who are attracted to girls who are 12 to 14 years of age, in other words, right after they have achieved puberty, are called hebephiles, which means young women at the dawn of puberty. Then there are men who are attracted primarily to young women between the ages of 15 and 16, and they're called ebephiles, which means youths. And finally, there are men who are attracted primarily to women who are between 17 and 19. Remember, these young people are very far from being children, and they're called teleophiles, which means essentially full grown. In the essay, I walk the reader through every one of these characterizations, and I show that Ruskin meets none of the characterizations for these other paraphilias. Ruskin was not a paraphiliac. He was not only not a pedophile, he was not any of these other things as well. So here's our first conclusion. There is no viable evidence which has ever been found that would allow us to conclude that John Ruskin suffered from any of the paraphilias, pedophilia, hebephilia, ephebophilia, or teleophilia. To the contrary, the extant evidence points to a conclusion, it would have been better worded, that Ruskin was sexually normal, which sexuality expressed itself in a particular manner as a result of the effects of certain life circumstances. So the first thing that I want to leave you with tonight is that anybody who comes to you in the future, and it's likely to happen, still happens to me, people come to you and say, well, he's the fellow who was abnormally interested in young girls. It's not true. When you read the letters that Ruskin wrote, where he talks about so many girls, he's talking about girls who are 10 and 14 and 16 and 19 and 22 and so on, a whole raft of different girls, but none who are in any of these particular categories. Okay, so that's the first conclusion. Now, I want to pass on to a brief description of the principal loves of Ruskin's life. And as I said, this is definitely not going to be a walk down triple X lane. But I want you to get a sense of the erotic life, such as it was, that he lived. So here are something about the principal loves of Ruskin's life. Here, I want to go back because the first one, her name is Adele Domeck. And I have no picture of her. I can't find any picture of her anywhere near the age that we're talking about here. She was the daughter of Ruskin's partner, Ruskin's father's partner in the sherry trade. And they came to England to visit when Ruskin was 17 and Adele was 14. She's one of I think the three daughters of that family. And Ruskin fell head over heels in love with Adele. It was puppy love, but it was particularly intense. He thought she was glory incarnate. And he wrote dozens of poems to her, about how he worshiped her and how beautiful she was, and how when the time came together, they would marry and they would be together for the rest of their lives. He was just mooning in all the senses that young people can do when they first fall in love. But Adele, sophisticated young French woman that she was, thought he was just a naive little fellow and really would have nothing to do with him. And every time he would approach, and he didn't do that very often because he was very shy, every time that he would approach, she would reject him, push him away, and tell him he was just being a silly little boy. And it crushed him for years. married a French count and, of course, lived a life over there. He saw her later on in his life. But it really was the first crushing blow, which is why it's important to remember Adele in Ruskin's life, because 50 years later, when he was writing his autobiography called Praeterida, he talks about Adele at some length in one of the early chapters and laments a half century later that he had lost her. He has a passage where he said, if only love had been with me then, everything would be so different now. So she's important in a fundamental way because she sort of sets a tone of love lost in Ruskin's life. The second one, of course, you all know certainly from our discussion of last week, was Euphemia Chalmers Gray, or Effie as she was known to almost everyone. Where Effie was very beautiful, as you can see. She was part of the family circle in Scotland at some distance, and she met Ruskin when she was a teen, and she came to London as well with her family, and Ruskin was already famous. Ruskin was now 23 or 24, and she said to him, well, you're such a famous young fellow. She was rather snippy at the time. I bet you can never, you've never written a children's story. And he said, no, I never have. And he went upstairs, and the next morning he came down and delivered her a 60-page children's story called The King of the Golden River, which is in fact the only children's story that Ruskin ever wrote. And we had those of us who were at the Huntington Conference in San Marino last November or early December had a wonderful operatic presentation of The King of the Golden River, Ruskin's wonderful story. That was their first encounter. 10 years later, they met again. And Ruskin's parents thought it was time for him to get married. They wanted their son to be somebody who was living a stable life. They didn't like the fact that their boy was out there in the world kind of loose. He might be tempted by X or Y. Effie seemed like a good choice. And so the families got together. Ruskin wrote her letters. The letters of the time that he wrote are clearly love letters. He believes he loves her. And then for a long time, the marriage fell apart, as everybody knows. It fell apart in a very nasty way. And everybody blamed Ruskin for it for probably 50 years until this book came out, which I highly recommend to you if you're interested in it. It's Robert Brownell's book on marriage of Inconvenience. And he found a major set of letters called Le Bowerswell letters that are at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, which no one else had ever gone to have a look at. And he found in them many of these love letters that Ruskin had sent Effie before their marriage. And then he also learned in the letters, to his complete surprise, that one of the things that had happened just before the marriage took place is that Effie's father was in deep financial straits, and Effie decided that she would go ahead with the marriage. She wasn't so deeply sure about this Ruskin fellow. She liked him because he was very famous, but she would go ahead with the marriage because it would give her direct access to the Ruskin family fortune. And Ruskin found out about this about 2 weeks before the wedding, and being the deeply moral fellow that he was, thought this was a very bad mark against Effie's character. He went ahead with the marriage because he thought she would change in time. She did not. He found out over time that she was a rather shallow person, that she liked parties. She didn't care a whit about what he did in terms of his own work and his own life. And the marriage got further and further apart. They decided on the marital night not to consummate. Ruskin was not sure. I had a chat with Gabriel about this after the last talk. Ruskin was not sure that after a while that he wanted this person to be the mother of his children, who would then bring up his children in his name. So it began to be a very, very difficult relationship. She wound up hating him. I think he wound up seriously disliking her. And there was no way in Victorian England in the middle of the 19th century to get out of a marriage. The principle, men could have affairs, that didn't happen. If women had affairs, that could be grounds. But Effie did not have affairs. So the only way to get out of the marriage, there was a loophole in the marital agreements. The only way to get out of the marriage was for the husband, if she was not incapable of having children and had not had affairs, it was for the husband to be determined to be impotent. Well, Ruskin was not impotent. He made it very clear to his solicitor that he was not. He said it was quite possible for him to have sexual relations should he want to. It's just that they never had decided that they wanted to. And so he let the charge stand that he was in fact impotent, even though he was not. He never acknowledged the charge in public. And when it came time for the trial, and Ruskin would have been called to the bar to explain whether he was in fact as charged, Ruskin had escaped to the continent to start working on his next volume of a modern painter's book, and was not available to be questioned. So he did not lie, which Ruskin, as a matter of principle in his whole life, never lied. There was a great and enormous scandal about this. Effie had fallen in love with the pre-Raphaelite painter, John Everett Millais. They married, they soon had 8 children. Well, soon is probably not the right word, but they did have 8 children, and the scandal of it disappeared for a while, but it was always beneath the surface, and the blot on Ruskin's name, because he was the one, presumably at blame, everyone thought. Effie would very routinely denounce Ruskin in public in various contexts, and he never said a word about her himself. So the idea that he was the one to blame circulated all the time in gossip and so on, and it would essentially ruin his chance at 2 possible marital relationships later in life. The first with this lovely young woman who is Rose Latouche. This is an early photograph of, Ruskin's, an early watercolor of Ruskin's of Rose. He met her in 1859. He was 39 years old, on the cusp of 40. She was 9.5 years old, on the cusp of 10. And it was sort of like 2 star-crossed lovers from another life had found themselves in this life. And having found themselves were to each other for the rest of their lives. He loved her inordinately. He never touched her. He never approached her in any way sexually, but he wanted to marry her. And she was very confused about this. She was a very young person. She was now being courted by one of the most famous men in the European and English world. She doesn't know what to make of it and so on. He waits, he's very patient, he's very diligent. He tells her that he will propose to her. When she turns 18, he proposes to her. She's at the marital age. She's 18, mind you, not a child, right, mind you. And she says, well, give me 3 years to make up my mind. And so he says, okay, I will give you 3 years to make up your mind. And she takes the 3 years, and then she puts him off again. And then because she's so confused, she leaves her parents and she comes to England, and she lives in England for 2 or 3 years, associating largely with some of Ruskin's friends, dearest friends, and she begins to lose her mind. And she lasts until 1875. And by the time 1875 is there, she is emaciated. We think that she possibly had anorexia nervosa. She is out of her mind. She's mentally ill. She can't hold on to anything, and she dies and goes away. And Ruskin is crushed and never, ever gets over Rose. He loved her to his last day, as I will show you a little bit later. So now he's completely alone in the world. There is nobody on the horizon. And so he starts going to theater. And he has a series of relationships, none of them sexual. I should go back and say, there was one small thing with Rose. She granted him a kiss on the cheek once, and he was so delighted he remembered it the rest of his life. Anyway, Rose is now dead, 1875 and following. Ruskin is completely alone. Everybody hates him because of his political economy work. He's getting vilified in the press all the time. Nobody will join his Guild of St. George. And he's just remarkably alone, this great genius. So he starts going to theater in London. He develops sort of, in quotes, sort of quote, crushes on some of the actresses on the stage. On the left here, we have Connie Gilchrist. On the right, we have Katie, what's her last name, Vaughn. And he sees them, he has dinner with them, and he thinks he likes them, but it's all on this sort of surface level. He has other young women and girls with whom he exchanges letters with, none of them overtly sexual. Once in a while, in one or the other, there's a little titillating thing, and he says, "Oh, I'm very sorry, I was naughty. I have so much more experience than you." And of course, he doesn't have any more experience than any of these. He develops a long-standing relationship with Mary Gladstone, who is the daughter of the Prime Minister of England, and a really wonderful and brilliant woman. There's a whole series of letters that they exchange over a whole number of years. And finally, when she's 39 years old, she gets married, and that's the end of that relationship. He has another relationship beginning in 1880 with a young artist by the name of Kate Greenaway. And he loves Kate because she does these delightful drawings of young people, particularly young children. And Ruskin, at that point in his life, already feeling himself a massive failure in his ability to change the world, has decided he will now present to anybody who's still listening to him this idea of innocent and gentleness and goodness in life as the primary way for us to relate to one another. Kate does drawings that are like this. He wants to use Kate's drawings. Well, Kate falls madly in love with Ruskin, but not he with her. And she starts sending him letters, and they disconcert him amazingly. And he says, "I don't want to have anything to do with this." He tells her to back off. She does for a little while, and then she comes back. She would love to marry him, and so on. He starts burning her letters in the fireplace at Brentwood because he says he can't have these strange letters lying around the house. So she backs off again, and over time they kind of continue their relationship, but the whole intensity of it has been reduced over time to something less than it was. This is Lady Mount Temple. He has a number of very brilliant and wonderful women friends who are married to their own husbands in different places. This is Lady Georgiana Mount Temple. He calls her Granny, which is interesting. So what happens with these older women? It's really very, very interesting. Ruskin decides that he is never going to get in a situation where there might be any possible question about his relationship with them. She becomes Granny. Another friend of another, Mrs. Simon, becomes a sister, and then another friend of another married a wonderful person in England. She becomes Isola. Isola is the beautiful island, unreachable. So what's interesting, Rachel Dickinson writes about this at some length in her great book about Ruskin and Joan, which is essential to understanding Ruskin's emotional and sexual life. She writes about it, what Ruskin is trying to do is to recreate the family that he never had as an only child, the lonely life he lived as a child. He's trying to recreate around him an emotionally secure place, his granny, his sister, his beloved island, these glorious people who are very close to him, but whom he never wants to have anything come in the way of, anything erotic come in the way of their relationship. That's Francesca, whom those of you who were here last week heard about at some length. He meets Francesca Alexander in 1884 in Florence, who's living with her mother. She's an American expat. they very quickly become deeply intimate with one another in terms of their epistolary relationship and their emotional connection. There's 400 letters that have never really, no, they have never fully been published, and they're just so touching and so moving. And so Francesca becomes his sister. She becomes his sorella. He becomes her fratello, her brother. Again, a family relationship. But what I want to suggest to you about these sets of relationships that we've just worked our way through is that Ruskin is making a very, very clear conscious choice in all of these relationships. And his choice is to keep himself completely distant from them in terms of any possibility of having a sexual relationship. So Ruskin's sexuality is fundamentally normal. He is attracted to other women in an erotic way, but he is never, ever going to indulge in it. There's a passage from Micah in the chapter called Micah, chapter 6 in the Old Testament. And it begins in this way. He, meaning God, has told you, O man, what is good. What does God expect from you but to do justice, to live decently, and walk humbly with your God? If there was anything ever other than the golden rule, to treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, that is the watchword of Ruskin's life, it is this. He is never, ever going to put himself in a place where he will damage other human beings, and sexual relationships that are in any way illegitimate, meaning outside of marriage and outside of love, he's not going to have anything to do with. I call it Ruskin's choice. He decided to curtail his own sexuality because in the end, he didn't want to tempt it and give into it. He wanted to go, this is quite literally true, he wanted to go to his maker, whatever his other faults were, and he thought they were many and deep and terrible. He wanted to go to his maker and be able to never have to ask for forgiveness or clemency for any kind of emotional or sexual transgression in his life. That was Ruskin's choice. It's very interesting. It's very different. And of course, it was very deeply misunderstood by many who were willing to say that he was so bizarre, that he was such an asexual creature when he was not being a pedophile. He was so inflexible about his sexuality. There's a wonderful guy in the Ruskin world, an American collector of Ruskiniana. He's the most, probably the greatest collector of Ruskiniana in the United States. His name is Dyke Benjamin, and I'm good friends with Dyke, and we had a conversation once and we were talking about this. He said, those who hate Ruskin today, they hate him not because he had an affair, but because he didn't, which I thought was always terrific. So Francesca, I want to end this section with giving you something else as well. The relationship with Francesca and her mother goes on. Ruskin, oh, I forgot this one. I'll have to tell you about this very briefly. So the people who were in the talk last week heard about Kathleen Olander. Ruskin meets her in the National Gallery when he's staying at Folkestone and Sandgate. They develop a strong relationship. He's teaching her how to draw. He begins to fantasize that he might be able to marry her. They begin writing letters. He's very circumspect about his letters while he's on his last trip to the continent. And then in one letter, near the end, where he's almost at the end and he's teetering on the edge of sanity, he writes her and he says, it will be so lovely when you are my wife. She's shocked. She's 22. She's shocked. He's now almost 70. And she's shocked and she reports it to her parents. The parents are aghast that this old man wants to marry their daughter. They write to him telling him he has to shut it down. He says he will shut it down. He apologizes to Kathleen, and there goes his last chance. But raising its head in this situation as well is the parents finding out about Rose and finding out before that about the Effie business from almost 40 years before. So Ruskin is now essentially lumbered with the same rumors that have been going on about his strange sexuality in this situation. Here's a last little bit about Kathleen that you'll find interesting. Kathleen is never mentioned in the library edition of Ruskin's works. Never mentioned. She's written out of the story entirely, and it is only because she kept her letters that we know anything about this relationship. Okay, so Ruskin returns to Brantwood. I have something more that I wanted to share with you then, but I think I'll skip because I'm beginning to notice the situation of time, and I want to make sure I make the principal arguments that I had in mind for tonight. So here's Ruskin at Brantwood in the late 1880s and 1890s. And what I want to do now is that I want to talk about Ruskin's, I'm going to skip this because this was what I wanted to talk about. Rose is always there. She always, oh, the heck with it. I'm going to read you. I'm just going to read you a wonderful letter that Ruskin wrote in the, that are in the Alexander letters that are at the Boston Public Library in New York. This is the last letter that Ruskin ever wrote, Francesca. It's spring of 1893. And it's in those letters that I just told about. It's really incredibly beautiful, incredibly heartbreaking. And the reason that I want to share it with you tonight is partly because of this wonderful other picture of Rose that Ruskin painted. But no one else has ever heard this letter. It's never been read aloud until now in my awareness. It's never been read by anybody, of course, except for Francesca and perhaps her mother, Ruskin, and the people who inherited Francesca's letters after she died. And it goes as follows. It's the last substantive letter that I believe that Ruskin ever wrote before essentially he gave up his pen altogether. Here it is. My dearest Sorel, all is going on well here as far as I can judge of myself, and indeed I am thankful to see Joni for a time. That's his cousin, released from the anxiety, and worse than anxiety, the torture of seeing me in my dreams and passions, which are almost everything the contrary of my real self. But Sorel, dear, that one dream, that Rose guides me daily when I most need it, is a deliberately believed part of my life, which neither you nor Joni can understand, because with all Joni's trials, remember, she has her husband and her 5 sweet children, besides whatever good is left to her in me. And you have your mother and your companions and your friends. And remember, women who love each other can be ever so much more to each other than men can, unless they happen to be like David and Jonathan. And you have your dear companion Edwidge and your fratello, myself, who is really in his reverence for you and sympathy when he is himself a great possession. And then you have your Christ. And remember again, to women of your virginal temperament, Christ is as much a bridegroom as for St. Catherine, or for St. Agnes, or St. Barbara, or St. Mary. But men of my temperament, whether they are Burns or Byron or Horace, Christ is at the best a brother, in the highest sense, of course, a master or a judge. But we need the wife as the best part of ourselves. And Sorel, my dear, Rosie was, and he underlines this twice, Rosie was my wife, never possessed, but waited for to the grave. Think of her as an angel conscious of the past, watchful of the future, and of me of feeling myself always answerable for her death. And well, I won't write more like this today, for I have to tell you that the violets and anemones are in their prime, and the hyacinths and the gentians are coming out, and I'm able to get out and sleep a little bit, and I'm not idle all the day, and I'm a mind as good for nothing, filio, and your ever-loving fratello, perhaps a little good for something at last. That's a really beautiful letter, and the depression there at the last. So that's an overview of Ruskin's loves. Now, why Ruskin's biography was so radically distorted, and why, as a result, he was subsequently accused of the most heinous things. The library edition. Those of you who are around at the first talk or listening to the first talk know that after Ruskin died, the literary executors of his estate got together and decided they were going to create the greatest tribute to a living scholar, to a now dead scholar, a great scholar that had ever been done. And they decided to create something that they called the library edition of Ruskin's works. And here it is on all 39 volumes of it, lying out, taking up over 9 feet on the shelf and over 6 million words inside. But the people who created the library edition decided that they were going to do two things that Ruskin, of which Ruskin would never approve of. And two of the people who were involved were his executors, his cousin, literary executors, his cousin Joan and Alexander Wedderburn, who became one of the editors of the library edition. They decided they were not going to tell the full Ruskin story, that for matters of decorum, they didn't want to produce anything that would put Ruskin in bad light and his reputation. They were going to keep certain things out of the library edition. So to be kept out of the library edition was Catherine Olander. To be kept out of the library edition was many of his relationships with these younger women. To be kept out of the library edition was the full Rose story. To be kept out of the library edition was all the struggles that he had with his father. To kept out of the library edition was all of the relationships that never worked out for him in terms of keeping his sanity. They downplayed his mental illness. Then they did it because of decorum, and they did it for money. It's really good to have a good look at this library edition. 39 volumes issued over a course of 9 years, 2 volumes usually at a time. They cost quite a bit of money. So this was done in large measure for money. So they covered up Ruskin's story. It was a conspiracy. And it was so beautifully done. Again, I described most of this at the first talk. It was so beautifully done in scholarly manner that it hoodwinked everybody. Everybody thought the full Ruskin story had been told until Helen Fillion died in 1974. Her biography, incomplete, and her diary, this is Ruskin with Joan, in the 1890s at Brentwood. I really rather like this picture because it shows him and it shows who's the real mistress or master of Brentwood in the image. Anyway, Fillion dies in 1974, her biography undone. She was going to tell this Rose story in full for the first time. Van Bird comes along and he finds all her material on Rose Latouche, and he decides, because he knows Helen would like this, he decides he's going to write this great book on Ruskin and Rose Latouche, which he did, and I highly recommend it to you all. It is still the best thing by far that's ever been written on Ruskin and Rose, because he's such a magnificent scholar. So he writes this book, but it tells a story of Ruskin, a major story in Ruskin's life that's never been told before. So some other scholars come along after this and they say, wait a minute, that must mean that the library edition is not telling the full story. So if that's gone on, that's been covered up, maybe other things have been covered up. And so then appears in 1985, Tim Hilton, who decides that what's been covered up is Ruskin's abnormal interest in young girls, that Ruskin was actually a pedophile, which by now I hope you are very seriously convinced he was not, followed a number of years later by Catherine Robeson, writing on Ruskin and Men in Wonderland, and her fundamental argument that he was also a pedophile, and then the whole fiasco of Ruskin's sick, perverted sexuality gets out into the public arena, and he is essentially cut off at the knees in terms of his reputation over time, over a very short period of time. So I want to address why this is Collingwood's wonderful picture of Ruskin in his study at Brentwood in 1885. I want to address for just a few minutes here, why has it been so hard to convince other people that Ruskin wasn't the monster that so many people think he was? Why has the criticism of him been so virulent, so tenacious? And I want to give you two sociological arguments. And the first is, there's a wonderful book written probably 30 or 40 years ago by a sociologist by the name of William Ryan. And the title of the book is called Blaming the Victim. Here's the argument in brief. All societies are organized in a very carefully structured manner. The only way that the society stays together is that there's a series of norms or values that most, not everybody, that most of the people in the society agree on, that essentially set the frames or the boundaries of the society that keeps it working properly. If those boundaries disappear, all hell breaks loose. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and everywhere the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. So you must preserve these boundaries as much as you can in order to keep the center holding at all. Now, you and I, we live in a time in which sexual mores, which used to be very rigid, have all broken down, or almost all of them have broken down. We now permit, I'm not making judgments here, but now it's quite possible to be openly not married. It's quite possibly to be openly homosexual or lesbian. It's now quite possible to have all sorts of other sexual interests, legitimate human concerns. In other words, control of the sort of heterosexual control of the sexual impulse is now essentially washed away. What's left? Well, here's something that's left. What happened if people would be sexually interested in little girls or little boys? What happens if they're pedophiles? No, we say as a society, that is just too far. That breaks the last rule that is unbreakable. It will threaten the whole world. It will lead everything loose if we permit this. And so this is one thing we cannot allow to happen in the modern world. We do not take advantage of children if we're older. We need someone to stand as an example of this, someone that we can blame to stand as an example of someone who has broken these rules and is a heinous creature as the result of it. It's not unlike the witch trials of a long time ago. Well, who gets to be blamed? John Ruskin gets to be blamed because he has been accused publicly by scholars and many others as being a pedophile. And he is the perfect example to hold up as a cultural transgressor. He is white. He is male. He was enormously famous. He was and is now dead. He can't fight back. And he is someone who in his life, quite true, absolutely true, who believed in all the old traditional values like marriage and treating your neighbor as you would be treated yourselves. He believed in all of those things. He believed in family, in ethical living, all those things that they believed in 100 years ago, which they don't believe anymore, which we don't believe much anymore. He is, because of his pedophilia, he's even worse. He's a hypocrite. So who couldn't agree then? This is the argument that you hear out there, that such a person who's as terrible as this should be condemned and vilified and rejected out of hand and essentially drummed out of the social core entirely, which is what has happened to Ruskin. So because of his supposed deviance, which we now know he didn't possess, because of his deviance, we hold him up as an example. Actually, Ruskin himself in this argument is not the case. He's the symbol that stands for the kind of behavior that we won't tolerate. So that's one of the reasons why Ruskin has been so vilified, and the ability to change our thinking about him has proved so difficult to eradicate. But here's the second one. Sorry. Okay. Here's the second one. The second one is also, I'm going to again make a sociological argument. The real Ruskin, or the deepest reason in the end that we don't want to let Ruskin back into the mainstream again, is because he threatens us, he terrifies us, and he accuses us of the things we do all the time. He gores all our oxes, and we don't like it because he is telling us, we suspect in our heart of hearts, the truth, or as Al Gore put it once, he's telling us an inconvenient truth that we don't want to hear. Very briefly, he gave a number of lectures in the 1860s after he wrote Unto This Last, when he begins attacking essentially laissez-faire capitalism. And he says, in essence, you people, later on, George Bernard Shaw, who loved Ruskin, said that he called his contemporaries a parcel of thieves. So he calls them these things, he calls them out on these things. He gave a lecture in Birmingham in 1864 called Of King's Treasuries. It is one of the greatest of his lectures. In fact, I think it is the greatest of his great lectures. And I profiled it on my blog recently. But in any event, at the end of his lecture, which is about the importance of reading, he comes around and looks his audience straight in the eye, and they're the highest ranking members of their society. They're dressed out in their finery. They're the religious leaders. They're the political leaders. They're the economic barons. They're the highest reputed people. And he looks them in the eye and he says, now I'm going to tell you what's really going on with yourselves. And he gives them a series of arguments that I like to call the despisings. He looks at them and he says, you all sitting before me, you despise literature because you don't read, and whatever you do read, it's foolish. He says, you despise nature, you rape the world for money, and you destroy everything that's beautiful because you have no understanding how glorious the world is. You despise art. You have the greatest artists in the world. You sometimes have their paintings on your walls. You just understand nothing about them. You understand nothing about why art is so important in human life. You put them on your walls for the purposes of status only. You despise science. Some of this is sounding very contemporary. You despise science. The only things that you fund or go after or believe in science are the kinds of things that support what you want to hear. You never want to hear what you don't want to hear. You don't want to study the things you don't want to study. And lastly, and most importantly, you despise compassion. And now he introduces in the lecture a series, one great example of a shoemaker in the Five Dials slum of London who essentially starves to death because he can't make enough money. There is no work for him. And whenever he's employed, he makes such a little amount that little by little he and his family starve to death. You despise compassion. How could such a thing happen in a Christian nation? You call yourselves Christians. You're ersatz Christians. You're fake Christians. You're people who go to church for 2 hours on a Sunday, and for the rest of the week, you spend the rest of your time finding ways to exploit and get every penny out of your neighbor's pocket as you possibly can. And so he argued in 1864. Guess what? They didn't like it. They left the lecture that night quite disappointed that they had invited this fellow so famous to come to talk to them, and all he did was excoriate them essentially for their own salacious lives in different ways. Ruskin never stopped. All the way through the 1870s, he wrote a series of letters to the working people of England, which we could talk much more about if we had more time, called Fors Clavigera, Letters to the Workmen and Laborers of Great Britain. If you read them, and I am now reading them fully for the second time, they are just full of one critique after another of the infidelity of his compatriots, their desire, their rage to be rich, as he calls it in Unto This Last, their willingness to crush their fellow human beings at a moment's notice if it will advantage themselves. He challenges them all the time. He never, ever stops. In the 1880s, as he's getting to the near end, he gives a glorious, incredibly important lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century about the willful destruction of the environment and the pollution of the world. He never lets them off the hook. And so they decide that the only way to get rid of him is to essentially accuse him of something. So they begin, so this is the essential argument. They begin by saying that the man is mad. And so when Unto This Last comes out, There are a series of incredible critiques of it. And he's called in one place a mad governess. He doesn't know anything that he's talking about. He should have stayed an art critic. He is misinformed on every fundamental point. He's out of his mind. And throughout the 1860s, he's called mad. And then what could be better? In 1878, he's at Brantwood. The pressure has become so much on him that he actually does go out of his mind. He loses his mind then and a number of times subsequently, and they say to themselves and to everybody else, you see, we were right all along. This man was a lunatic. Everything he's done is crazy. No one should take him seriously, and that's the point. They can drum him out of the core. They don't have to listen to his critiques and his despisings and his essentially accusations of him that he utters day after day, week after week, because he was a madman. And then in the middle of the 9th decade of the 20th century, Tim Hilton comes out with his book and says, this fellow was also a pedophile. Oh my goodness, what could be better? He wasn't only mad, he was a reprobate, an exploiter of young girls, someone who talks the golden rule, talks about walking in God's path, and is a hypocrite and essentially goes against every one of these dictates. He is the worst kind of fellow imaginable. Let's not pay any attention to John Ruskin anymore. And there goes the reputation. And that, I submit, is why we find it so hard to get past the accusations against Ruskin. I call it in the essay, I call it, we set up an impossibly high bar. No one can get over that level of vituperation very easily. So that's why it's so tough to get rid of Ruskin. Now, lastly, just a few minutes, and then I'll be done. I want to talk about reclaiming Ruskin, what I regard as the whole purpose of all of these talks, the reasons that I wanted to tell you about these parts of Ruskin's life that had never come to light before, starting with Helen Fillion, starting with Van Bird, is that I wanted you to know something about the life this man really lived. From first to last, it was a noble life. It was an ethical life. Ruskin worked every day of his life, even when it threatened his mental health and his physical health, to do something that would be good for other people. And so they couldn't take it. It's sort of like Christ himself. It's sort of like Gandhi. It's sort of like Martin Luther King. They couldn't take somebody who essentially told them the truth and then lived the life that they themselves were not living. They couldn't stand it, so they tried to get rid of him. This is Hubert von Herkomer's wonderful portrait in the National Portrait Gallery in London. This is the plaque of Ruskin that shows him in his nobility on the mountain above Chamonix, the impossibly high bar. Helen Fillion began to crack down the story after her visit to Brantwood in 1929. She worked 45 years to try to tell the story of Ruskin's life. She died. She didn't get it done. The Chalice Fallen was picked up by Van Aken Bird, my dear friend. Many of us knew him while he was alive, who wrote his own books on Ruskin's life and tried to set the story right. But the point fundamentally has been is that it didn't wash. None of that washed, essentially because Ruskin had been accused in a public court of doing things that he never did, and essentially so we could get rid of the parts of him that make him, and I dare say us, still uncomfortable. This is Gabriel's sculpture image of Ruskin done by Gustav Borglum, which he's got in his home. It's a very beautiful portrait, and again, to me, displays Ruskin's nobility of life. So we've made a grave error, is what I'm arguing, that here we have one of the greatest figures of Western history. Here we have one of the most important social critics and visionaries of a better life that we've ever had, and we've made him essentially irrelevant to the rest of our lives. And because of these misinterpretations of his life, we discredit him wherever we can. What can we do about it? Okay, I'm going to suggest a couple of things and then I'm done. Number one, I would behoove you, if any of these lectures have taken hold in any fundamental way, I would behoove you, whenever you hear these criticisms laced against Ruskin, or unjust criticisms laced against Ruskin, that you fight against them, that you tell them, we now know that none of this is true, that his madness was caused not by some congenital condition, that he went out of his mind because of terrible things that had happened to him in his life, that he was never a pervert sexually, he never abused anybody, he never judged anybody, negatively except those who were exploiting others. So fundamentally, the people who knew him and understood him in his own time, George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, the Brownings, William Morris, Gandhi, Tolstoy, all the people that I mentioned in my first lecture, all understood who the real Ruskin was. And so we come around to the end that all these giants loved him and understood what he was and so in his life, and why we should have him in our lives. So the final thing I want to bring you to as you think about these things is that I want to bring you to the last sentences of a wonderful article as we end, a wonderful article that appeared in the American Scholar, maybe 5 or 8 years ago. It was written by an American literary critic by the name of Phyllis Rose. And she loved Ruskin, understood him, and felt very, very poorly about how he had been treated in the modern intellectual world. And so her essay is essentially a way to get us to think about reclaiming Ruskin, is my phrase. So she ends her essay with the following sentences. She said the greatest sentences that has ever been written about Ruskin, particularly in the light of these talks. She ends her remarks as follows. She says, if we are ever going to do justice to Ruskin, we must read him again, for it is only in the words, it is only in the beautiful images, it is only in the wonderful arguments, it is only in the humanity and depth of that humanity that we come to understand him and his incredible importance. Read Unto This Last. Read Fors Clavigera. Read Modern Painters, The Stones of Venice, The Crown of Wild Olive. Read the incredible prefaces to Sesame and Lilies and the Bible of Amiens. Ruskin's hard going, so don't aim at covering much at one time. Read a passage, read just a sentence before you go to sleep every night. I think you will find that John Ruskin is very good in bed. So that's basically the end of the story that I wanted to tell you tonight. So whether we meet Ruskin by the fast-flowing Rhone in Geneva or in a lecture hall in London in the mid-1880s when he's excoriating his contemporaries for despoiling God's beautiful earth and pitiless exploitation of his fellow workers, Ruskin speaks to us today still. He has been done an enormous injustice. We should reclaim him, bring him back, and tell everybody about him. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm back.
Okay. We had a little moment there, a little event of some sort. Okay. Questions, comments? I know there have been, I've been aware that there was a good deal of chatting and comments people were making during the presentation. I really urge us all to engage. We have time for some discussion. Jim has given us such rich material over these last 3 lectures that I'm sure there are some issues that we'd like to surface. Anyone? Stuart.
Gabriel. Oh.
Yeah. Can you recommend some recent biographies of Ruskin that are, you've been suggesting a number of books about him, but is there a recent comprehensive biography?
No.
Recommend instead of Hilton? Not at all.
No. But, well, I mean, there really aren't. In my view, the The great biography of Ruskin has yet to be written. It has to be a young scholar who is willing to devote years to this, and so critically importantly, devote a massive amount of time to the Ruskin archives that are in the United States that the British biographers all miss, and that has contributed mightily to the tragedy. However, there are two great biographies of Ruskin that I can recommend to you, even though they are now somewhat out of date. The first one I can recommend is the first, which was written by his dear friend and former secretary and former student at Oxford, William Gershom Collingwood. Collingwood loved Ruskin. He understood Ruskin, and he wrote a biography, a 2-volume biography beginning in first edition came out 1894, and then he did updates of it until in more or less the end of the first decade of the 20th century. It's a wonderful biography. It's deeply felt. It's honest. He doesn't, what's the best way to say this? He doesn't come out and tell you all the things that I've just told you, but he never glosses over anything. He tells you the truth about Ruskin, about his depression. He tells you the truth about Ruskin, about his very unhappy emotional life. It's a wonderful biography and beautifully written, and first composed actually while Ruskin was still alive. The second one, which I have loved since I first read it and highly recommend to you, and it's still around, is called, Gabriel's holding it up before you right now, it's called Ruskin, the Great Victorian, and the author is a British fellow by the name of Derek Lyon, who had also before that written a biography, wonderful biography of Tolstoy. Well, he too loves Ruskin. I think it's a sine qua non. If you're going to do a Ruskin biography, you have to love him and you have to love what he stood for. And Lyon knows Ruskin. There's a great advantage to Lyon's book that we don't find as much of even in Collingwood's book. And that is he takes the time as his chapters roll on to essentially give you a synopsis of the great books that Ruskin is writing at each point in his life, so that you have a sense of why Ruskin was great. Hilton is only one example, and I don't blame him in any way exclusively for this. Hilton never gives you any sense of what Ruskin is doing and why he's so important to the world. He never gives you summations of Ruskin's works and why they continue to be important. So both of those books are well worth your time. They're both out of date. We know a lot more now. Lyon's book, the Ruskin, the Great Victorian, came out in 1949. So gosh, it's 60 years old now, 50, 70 years old now. But still, he gets it. He's the first one to introduce new material on Rose Latouche that anybody had done ever since the library edition. And by the way, Rose only got into the library edition at all because Ruskin knew they were going to suppress her story. And he sent his letter about her, which is in Praeterda. It's one of the last chapters in Praeterda. He sent it directly to George Allen, his publisher, so that it wouldn't fall into Joan's hands and she would suppress it. So anyway, so those two biographies, nothing recent. You're much better off going to the scholarly studies like Van Bird's book on Ruskin and Rose than you are on the biographies.
Thank you.
Zach's got something.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jim, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to Van Bird's book on Ruskin and Rose, because I think for people who are thinking about Ruskin's sexuality, and particularly the pedophilia argument, I think Rose is the sticking point, as I was sort of reading through the chat. And so I wonder if you could just comment on what insights Van gave as a result of looking at those letters in relation to their relationship.
Yeah, good question. So what was the most revelatory about the Ruskin and Rose book, and as I said, Helen was going to do this in her own book, but never did. What was the most revelatory about it was how important she was in his life. Once Rose came into Ruskin's life, she was like the morning star in his day for the rest of his life. There's nothing to suggest this in the early biographies that were written after his death. There's nothing to suggest this in the library edition. And the reason for this is that the people who compiled the library edition didn't want to think just what you've said, that there was something untoward about this. that Ruskin's love of Rose was somehow abnormal. You know, you go back in history, you know, there's a phrase for this. It's called presentism. It means judging people in the past by the standards of now, which, you know, it's kind of in its way. You can have your feelings about people in the past and what they did and didn't say, but usually didn't say or think. And it's usually because their culture never gave it to think of. So, for example, as you know, Zach, I'm a great admirer of Plato. I love Plato. I studied him very deeply for most of my professional teaching life. And Plato lived in Greece in 400 BC, which essentially still had slaves. And Plato doesn't say much about slaves. He doesn't condone it. He doesn't not condone it, but he doesn't say anything about slaves. But Plato was often criticized because there were slaves around. Well, he didn't think about it. And it's kind of illegitimate when you think about it to go back and critique him for something that he would have never thought about. Plato is also criticized for being a sexist. Well, you know, if you read the Republic carefully, which I have, and I know that you have as well, if you read the Republic carefully, for 400 BC, he gives women almost every right that he gives men. It's amazing. We don't know anything about these things. So presentism is going on in Ruskin's case all the time. So back to Ruskin and Rose very quickly. So Van exposes something that's never been exposed before. And I tried to say this a few minutes ago. And people say, my God, there's this relationship with this young girl. And it seems to be obsessive. It seems to be strange. Maybe there's other things that are covered up. And then I said after that, not too long after that, comes along Hilton, and Ruskin becomes a pedophile, etc. But the fundamental thing in the fundamental argument, Van didn't make this argument because it didn't occur to him at the time that he was writing his book, is that when you take Ruskin and you compare him, as I tried to do at the very beginning of the talk, with the known psychiatric criteria of what constitutes what we would call diseased sexual attitudes towards young girls, Ruskin doesn't fit any of them. Number one. Number two, all of Ruskin's sexuality, such of it as there was, is always addressed to older women. Either older young women or women in their 20s, very rarely in their 30s, but young women that he admires for other reasons, but he never approaches any of them with sexuality in mind. So Van's book is very important, not only as a scholarly study, but secondly, it's very important because it sort of is the crack in the dam, but then everybody goes through the crack in the dam without doing any research about what they're essentially proclaiming for the next 20 years.
So, Jim, I'm curious if you've actually talked to Catherine Robson or Hilton, because they are young contemporaries that are reinterpreting Ruskin, and they should be on the Zoom. They should be here this evening, actually.
Yeah. I haven't talked to either of them. I don't know whether they know of this argument that I'm making. I have no problem if they do know of this argument that I'm making. I think that I've closed the doors on what they did and what they didn't do. And I'm essentially arguing that it's pretty poor scholarship on both of their parts, which then somehow got translated into a salacious culture that made so much else of it that was not fair to Ruskin or to the rest of us who have some reason that we actually care for Ruskin. So no, I haven't been in touch with them. If they show up, I'm happy to have a chat with them.
Good. She's
Jim?
at UC
Jim?
Davis.
Yes, Gabriel.
Yeah, just a comment on that. I know a number of major Ruskin scholars like Robert Hewison, for example, in the UK, has been in discussions with Tim Hilton, for example. And Hewison simply said that there isn't a major Ruskin scholar in the world who takes Hilton seriously on this issue, and many people have spoken to Hilton directly about the careless use of this word in his biography. And I think it for a large 2-volume work on Ruskin, I think it's really had the effect of diminishing the respect that one would normally accord such a major piece of work. Another thing which I thought I just mentioned is our colleague Sarah Atwood, a Ruskin scholar from Portland, Oregon, has written a fine book on Ruskin's educational philosophy, which focuses significantly on the educational aspects of his work with children, particularly at the Winnington School for Girls, where Ruskin lectured for many years. And Sarah emphasizes two things. One, that Ruskin really focused on teaching these young girls critical thinking.
That's right.
At a time when education for Victorian girls was largely ornamental, or to prepare them for motherhood, the Ruskin was teaching these girls critical thinking methods, was quite radical in his approach to education. And beyond that, we remember the talk at Huntington Library this last December, where Dinah Birch again emphasized the response that women at the turn of the 20th century had to Ruskin as a figure, seen as a figure again who was empowering women.
That's right. Let me just say one or two quick things about it. You're quite right about all of that. I didn't make a strong enough point in the talk that Ruskin loved children because they were as yet uncorrupted by the world. He loved their innocence. He loved their exuberance. He loved their joie de vivre. And he liked being around them for one reason that I did mention in the talk, because they relieved him of the depression that he felt almost all the time. But he loved them for their sweetness as human beings. He thought they were really human beings in perfection before they got out into the wider world and got essentially crushed and corrupted by it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, which is one of the reasons why he paid so much attention to them, as you said, Gabriel, and why he wanted to educate them. The beginning of everything, he says somewhere, I think it's in one of the Fours letters, the beginning of everything is education from the very youngest age up. That's how you begin to create a really lovely, noble, socially responsible human being. I think Ted Bosley had something, but maybe he's logged off.
No, Jim, thank you. Thank you very much for this once again, and for the entire series. It's really been an eye-opener for all of us, I think, and certainly for me. I'm curious to know what, if anything, that you're aware of are the Ruskin sites, the places that pretend to guard his legacy. I'm talking about Brantwood and the museum in Sheffield. What, if anything, are you aware of that they are doing to counteract this, the effects of the mythologies of his life, as you've laid them out so well?
Well, that's a great question. So my answer is very little on that topic. What they are trying to do, and they deserve a lot of appreciation for, is that they're trying to take Ruskin's legacy on education, say, on the environment, say, and many of his social critiques. And they're trying to play those as the wonderful things that they are. I don't know of any particular site in England, and certainly in the US, where there are fewer, where they take on these issues directly. As Gabriel said a minute ago, the British scholars are aware, and many American scholars are aware of the issues about Ruskin's sexuality and madness that we've talked about in this series. But they don't really do much about going there. They're going to emphasize the very best of Ruskin, and they're certainly right to do that. But I think my own personal feeling, as you can tell from the talks, is that we have to get past what I call the impossibly high bar, because Ruskin is rejected out of hand by huge numbers of people who know nothing about him, and certainly know nothing about the literature that contradicts the things that they take for granted. We've got to get past that, and that's what these talks and these essays that I've written are really meant to do, that it is no longer a legitimate thing to say that John Ruskin was a sexual pervert. It just wasn't. true. If anything, he was the opposite.
Jim, if I again could add a point, that one of the things that a lot of us were gratified in 2019, the bicentenary of Ruskin's birth, was the relative absence of the dragons, as I like to call them, the relative absence of the dragons in the media coverage. And I asked myself why, because there had been periods only a few years earlier where you would have to get through this jungle of language about Ruskin's interest in young girls and all this stuff to finally get to a positive evaluation of his vision, of his ideas. But by 2019, I was really struck, both in the UK and the US, about how little of that there was. I think all of us were sort of relieved, and how much focus there was even in the media coverage of the bicentennial about Ruskin's ideas. If I asked myself why, I think we're in such crisis territory now. And I think we sense in Ruskin a visionary who's speaking to the ecological, to the social, to the political crisis that we're in, that I think we don't have time for this. We have less time for it now, that we need Ruskin more. And so that I think there's a tendency, again, just it was remarkable in 2019. I thought that there was less, static on these issues that you've so well described for us.
Well, I think you're right, and I'm delighted by it. And I was delighted by the conference for the reasons you've just said. And maybe we are just going to be able to get past this. And again, for the reasons that you just said, people are beginning to realize what an enormously powerful and humane thinker Ruskin was. I mean, one of the things that's bothered me from all along is simply that. My reading of Ruskin is that he is those things. He's powerful, he's important, he's humane, and all of these things that suggested that he was none of these things, which I knew not to be true intuitively before I undertook the studies that I told you about. That's what really, really made me the most upset, that we were missing this wonderful thinker in our own lives when he could help us so much.
Right.
Anyone else?
I had this one curious thought about Rose, in that her decline and your stated analysis of her anorexia nervosa. Could it be that the attraction between Rose Latouche and Ruskin has something to do with the electricity of her persona, which led inevitably perhaps to this nervous condition, this decline, and that the angelic or the elfin or the spirit quality of her comes in part from the electrical discharge of an inherently nervous, I won't say nervous, an inherently electric personality. So that there's this connection, this chimerical, chemical connection between a great prodigy who has the love of beauty in every way, architecture, landscape, flowers, nature, people, writing, thinking, and an electrical creature who just happens to be on the edge of decline, but nevertheless, at 9, 10, 14, astonishing. I've met such people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're onto something. As I said a moment ago, as soon as he met her, that was it. He never loved anybody else. I mean, he would have gotten together with Kathleen Olander late in a sort of simpatico relationship, but it wouldn't have been the same. He only really loved one person in his life, and that was Rose. And she only loved one person in her life in that way, and that was Ruskin. It was like they were joined at the hip, as I said, like they had come from different lifetimes and they found each other in this life, and it didn't work out well here either, but there was no way that they could divest themselves of each other. They're tied together like Romeo and Juliet forever, these two.
Tragic love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's enormously tragic. There's a lot more that could be said. I won't say much of it. Ruskin found in a young woman, if we're thinking psychiatrically, Ruskin found in a young woman who was also raised in a very strict evangelical home. And by then he was no longer an evangelical. He had given it up. And one of the great strains between him and Rose was that Rose said he was a pagan. And he said, I am a pagan. And she said, well, I can't marry somebody who's a pagan. I need somebody to believe that every word in the Bible is true, was one of the things that was between them their whole time. I mean, there's another issue, and that is that her mother really liked Ruskin. And there's never anything that developed, but there's certainly material in the letters that exist that suggest that. It's so complicated. But I like your idea a lot. Because I think it's true. As you say, we've met people in our lives who have those attractions, and that's it, man. That's it. That's what they did. That's what they got.
We should conclude.
Well,
yes.
Yes, okay.
We're probably the only ones left.
Oh, no. With a group.
No, we're all here.
26 people are on.
We're all here.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great. I've enjoyed it immensely. It's been wonderful to see people that I know and love, and to see new people that I will in time. And it's been great. And thank you for the hospitality. It's just been, for me, a delight to give a chance to talk about these things.
Thank you all.
Terrific.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Good night.
Again, if you're interested in reading fuller versions of this material, Jim's monographs on the Ruskin biography are available on his blog, whyruskin at wordpress.com. We've recorded all 3 lectures, and they will be soon, the edited versions anyway, will be available on Jim's Why Ruskin blog, and also on the Ruskin Art Club website at www.ruskinartclub.com. Just very quickly, I wanted to alert everyone to our full, very full, October schedule of virtual events. On Monday, October 5th, 7 to 8:30 p.m., we'll be sending out notices about all these things, but we have an evening with David Judson of Judson Studios. Ruskin scholar Sarah Atwood will be interviewing David, who's the president of the historic Judson Studios in South Pasadena, about his recent history of this 123-year-old architectural glass manufacturer. And David will also take us on through some of the new and remarkable directions the Judson Studios is pioneering in architectural glass. Secondly, we will have a live stream screening, we've arranged that, of the award-winning documentary, The Biggest Little Farm, directed by filmmaker and farmer John Chester. The film is a testament to the complexity of nature, following John, his wife Molly, and their dog Todd on an epic odyssey to attempt to farm within a reawakened ecosystem. It's a remarkable film about this couple in Moore Park, just 40 miles north of Los Angeles, regeneratively growing more than 200 varieties of fruits and vegetables on 214 acres of land, with sheep, cows, pigs, chickens, and ducks, with care and respect, while working in harmony, or as they put it, or a comfortable level of disharmony within our dynamic ecosystem. So this will be a marvelous opportunity both to see the documentary, and then John will come on for a on-site 45-minute hour Q&A following the film. Last but not least, we spoke earlier about arts and crafts movements. The Roycroft campus, the Ruskin Society of North America, the Guild of St. George are sponsoring a virtual conference, Ruskin, Roycroft, and the Arts and Crafts Movement. That's a virtual conference on all the Saturdays in October, the 5 Saturdays at 11 a.m. There's a registration fee of $50 to attend the 5 sessions, which will feature an international array of speakers on the topic of Ruskin and Elbert Hubbard, the founder of the Roycroft community. Elbert Hubbard's influence on arts and crafts, ideals, and designs. For information, www.roycroftcampuscorporation.com. All these events and more will be posted on our website, so please visit the website, sign up for the newsletter, and keep up with all that's going on. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for these lectures.
Thank you.
Thank you.